Okay, so this is the 10th video in our series, Torah in its Ancient Israelite Context, which is derived from Dr. John Walton and J. Harvey Walton's book, The Lost World of the Torah. We're going to be talking about an interesting topic in this section, and that is equal relevance. This is a challenging topic in part because this is not how your typical Protestant, not how your typical evangelical thinks of the law, and we will see why we have that issue and where that comes from as we dig in. So, viewing Torah in context, here's the second point in that section of the book that we're talking about here today. The Torah shouldn't be divided into categories of relevance. Let's see why. Two immediate problems arise. The first is that this approach treats the Torah as legislation. Even by the time we get to the New Testament cultural perceptions have changed, and both the Jewish scholars and the New Testament authors who interact with them are thinking of Torah in terms of legislation. That is not the purpose in the ancient Israelite context. Okay, so we dealt with that in previous videos in this series, right? The idea that it was not legislation for them in Moses' day because they're a pre-legislative society. That's just not how they operated. But the shift over that 1500-year time period, by the time we get to the New Testament era, to the first century, we see that both the Jewish rabbis and the Christian leaders are interacting with the Apostle Paul among them, the Torah as legislation, because again, it had shifted over time. And so our thought of dividing it into areas of relevance is approaching the Torah on that front, or interacting with it in a first century mode, not in an ancient Israelite mode. So when attempts are made to preserve the moral law from the Torah, the decision has already been made that the focus of the Torah is not only law, normative legislation, but morality. These presuppositions do not square with the Old Testament context. So as Walton has established previously, as we've talked about previously, it's about wisdom, not morality. That is order, not legislation. Again, and we're going to be recycling those ideas a little bit and applying them to this topic of relevance. So one of the problems with saying there's ceremonial law and civil law and moral law is that we are saying that some of it is law, right? It is legislative, but because it's not, then this whole thing is built sort of on a house of cards, and that's not a we can have the conversation about whether that's a relevant way of interacting with the text based on the first century's understanding, but it's not based on the ancient Israelites' understanding, and that's a key thing to understand to apply to our conversations and our discussions of the Torah. So let's take a look at one of those Reformation era creedal statements. We could look at a bunch of different ones. They're pretty much all the same. This is from the 39 Articles of Religion, 1571. It's definitional for the Anglican and Episcopal churches. The relevant one is section A, number 7. It says, of the Old Testament, the Old Testament is not contrary to the New, for both in the Old and New Testament, everlasting life is offered to mankind by Christ, who's the only mediator between God and man, being both God and man. Wherefore, they are not to be heard, which feign that the old fathers did look only for transitory promises. Although the law given from God by Moses as touching ceremonies and rites do not bind Christian men, nor the civil precepts thereof ought of necessity be received in any commonwealth, yet notwithstanding, no Christian man whatsoever is free from the obedience of the commandments which are called moral. And so, during the Reformation era, they saw this as having categories. One category, moral, was incumbent upon everyone, everywhere, whereas the others, the ceremonies and rites and the civil, were not. Again, they're interacting with the way Torah was understood in Paul's day, in the first century, in the early church. That's not how it was understood in the ancient Israelite context, and therefore they were doing the best that they could with an understanding that was handed down to them that had shifted. Again, the Apostle Paul is dealing with his issues in his day, right? He is acting and reacting in the context in which he lives, not in the ancient Israelite one. And so rather than continuing in that mold, we're, again, Walton is saying, and I'm trying to get in this direction, that we can do better than that. We can do better than looking at the Torah like that. So the second problem concerns the coherence and integrity of the Torah as a whole. The Israelites would not have considered it legitimate to make such distinctions and thereby choose what has validity and what does not, nor would Jesus or the New Testament authors. And again, of all of the things that I have run into with Hebrew Roots movement folks, and particularly First Fruits of Zion, 99% of it, frightening and heretical and whatnot, the things that I've pointed out. This is one small thing where they're hitting on a truth, although using it wrongly, right? The truth is they're saying you can't divide it up. You can't say some are more relevant than others. It's all relevant. It's all equal. And Walton would say, yes, their problem, of course, is they're saying it's all equally eternal law for all people, for all places, for all times, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what Walton is saying, the exact opposite of how the ancient Israelites would have viewed it. So again, if the ancient Israelites did not see distinctions in the various forms, again, they had rites and rituals, they had treaty obligations, but they were all relevant to them. They were all necessary to them, equally so, because they were a part of their relationship with God, part of maintaining the presence of God in their midst. So the Torah in its entirety pertains to order and provides wisdom for that order to be maintained. That order integrates all three of the categories that are identified in the Torah. Its integrity and coherence resist dissection. It's only when we're thinking of legislation that is normative as rules to be obeyed that we encounter this problem. All of Torah is culturally relative in that it's all situated. It's neither a legislative system nor a moral system. Okay, that's a lot to break down there. Let me do my best. Let me start with a comment at the bottom and then I'll back up. It says, because Torah isn't a system at all. Again, the ancient Israelites did not think in terms of the kinds of systems that we are trying to the categories that we're trying to impose on the Torah. It wasn't a legislative system, a moral system, or any other kind of system. Our arguments about what kind of system it is, right, and how to treat it as a system are missing the point. Such debates are all, by nature, anachronistic. Right, we are imposing ideas from later, from the Greco-Roman world onto the ancient Israelites, because we're not treating the Torah as they would have treated it. Again, and this is a challenge, and this requires conversation and wisdom and some understanding, and so it's going to be difficult and it's going to take work. So again, the purpose of Torah for the ancient Israelites, right? Wisdom, order, the presence of God, right, and covenant obligations. You can't dissect that into pieces. It all works together. Our problem is that we, again, and this was a problem in the first century, a problem during the Reformation, it's still a problem to this day, are looking at the Torah as a legislative system. And when we look at it as a legislative system, we say to ourselves, well, obviously, some of this cannot be maintained, and therefore we come up with all these ways of categorizing it, which again, we created the problem. It's not the text's problem, because that's not how the ancient Israelites viewed it. It's a interpretive problem that has historical roots going back to the first century. And so the challenge is to overcome that and to understand the text, again, in a better way. Let's keep going. Again, if this is difficult, if you're struggling with some of these concepts, it's perfectly fine. Again, if you haven't thought about these things before, these are big concepts, big changes in the way that we think about the Torah. We may end up in largely the same place in terms of the respect we give to God's word, in terms of the use we put it to. But we're going to arrive there in a much healthier way, in a much more a way that speaks of or that reflects the original author's intent, the original audience's understanding much more, much better. And of course, that's something we desire. So Torah is a variously situated document, a covenant agreement locked in an ancient culture and the product of a geotheological setting in which Israel serves as the host to the presence of Yahweh. Again, it had to be variously situated. All of Scripture is variously situated because it arrives through a medium, right? Through authors in a time, in a place, in a situation, in a cultural setting, in a cultural river, to use the term from the first episode in this series. And so it's going to have that. It has to have that. The Torah, for the most part, did not promote a different order from that familiar to the ancient Near East, and therefore didn't offer an ideal social structure. This is going back to an idea that we've talked on previously in this series. Again, because most of the Torah is very similar to the neighboring religious ideas, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Persians, the Assyrians, and all the rest of them, it's not legitimate to look at it as an ideal social structure. All right, but again, because it's not radically changing that social structure that existed in Moses' day. All right, again, there are important changes, there are important deviations from that, but not overall in every way, right, from top to bottom. It's not what God was trying to do there. Turn them into a panacea, into a utopia. That's not the purpose of the Torah. So don't act as if the text is trying to create that. So indeed, since the point was to establish a reputation for Yahweh as patron of order, this could only be done using more or less the conception of order that the observers could recognize. This is a key point, right? And we've made it before, but we'll say it again because it's important. God is showing the Israelites, right, that he is the path forward. He's showing the neighbors of the Israelites that this is something better than what they had. But he's got to work within their expectations and understandings, or it wouldn't have worked, right? If he had gone to Moses and talked about individual rights and democracy, right, and free market capitalism and all of the things that we may hold up as ideals in the modern Western world, they wouldn't have understood what he was talking about. It wasn't a part of their cultural river. It would not have fit their understanding. Or if you don't think that the modern Western ideals are the proper ideals, which is fine, then whatever ideals you're putting in place there, if they're not ones that fit in the ancient Near Eastern context, then they would not have worked. So instead of describing an ideal society, it addressed how the Israelite people should maintain their culture's conception of order in the relatively unique context of a vassal relationship with deity. That is, the covenant relationship with Yahweh. So God is showing them how to be the best version of the people that they are, of the time and the place that they are, the best version of that. Not the best version of any of some non-contextual, non-culturally situated society. Again, the idea that we could conceive of such one is kind of impossible. We have our own cultural river. We are influenced by the setting which we find ourselves in. We're not a tabula rasa. We're not a blank slate. So for us to come up with an ideal society and say, this is what God's ideal society is. We've studied the scriptures. We've figured it out. Here's what it is. We are invariably going to be reflecting our own ideas as much as God's in some combination thereof. And so we can't it wouldn't be any different for us. I guess is the point I'm trying to make there. All right, let's keep going. An example of the Torah's ancient Near Eastern context, right? So if you're not on board with what Walton's saying yet, and you're saying, yeah, I don't think it's as contextual as you think, I don't think it's as situated as you think. Let's look at the text. Let's look at a few key issues, and there are many others, but look at a few key ones and see this in action. So the ancient world was a patriarchal world. Everybody knows that, right? And unsurprisingly, the Torah reflects a patriarchal paradigm. That doesn't mean that it endorses a patriarchal paradigm as God's will for all people of every place and time. The Torah is descriptive. We should neither criticize the Torah for condoning patriarchy, nor should we seek to enforce or imitate patriarchy today. Both extremes represent a flawed understanding of Torah. Okay, so in the ancient Near Eastern setting, the ideal in their mind, the proper way, all right, for society to function was a patriarchal model. So if God had gone to Israel and spoke about equal rights for men and women, they would have said, this is a crazy idea, and this is not what we want, and this is not wisdom, and this is not good. The neighbors around them, again, even if God had somehow convinced the Israelites to get on board with a more egalitarian system, the neighbors around them would have looked at it as a crazy experiment, and it would not have increased God's reputation among the peoples. So God uses a patriarchal paradigm because that's what they valued, without endorsing it for every generation to follow. Again, Paul, right, says in Christ there is neither Jew nor Gentile. We talked about that before. He also said there's neither male nor female. While at the still at the same time, Paul himself is reflecting the society in which he lives. Right, when he is giving directions to the church about its leadership and about its and about everything. Again, we have a big argument and conversation about women in ministry, whether or not women can be a priest or a pastor, right? That argument is this same argument, right? That's what should blow your mind for a minute. That argument is this same argument. Is the Apostle Paul writing something for all peoples, all places, and all times, or is it culturally situated? So we are having this exact same argument about the New Testament, and its context and how we interpret it. And again, I'm not going to tell people what their answer has to be, but understand these same ideas are at play. All right, the patriarchy of the ancient Near East is reflected in the Torah because God was giving them a proper reflection of order and wisdom in their setting. Again, so we don't take this as a endorsement of patriarchy as God's will. We don't scoff at it and say, how could God endorse this patriarchy? Because he's not. All right. Either way, right? If we are embracing it as for all people in all time, if we're mocking it as ancient foolishness, we're not understanding Torah the way it was meant to be. So many people who read the Torah get the impression that it fails to respect personhood or protect civil rights or personal freedoms, issues that rank high in American values. However, America's value system is not the same as the ancient value system. The Torah does not seek to communicate a quote-unquote biblical value system. It reflects an ancient value system exercised with integrity. And again, we struggle with this conversation all of the time. You hear politicians, pundits, podcasters, all sorts of folks talking about the biblical value system and sort of just putting it all together, Old Testament, New Testament, into one basket without any distinctions, without any understanding of its original context. That's a very dangerous way of doing it. Again, I talked also about proof texting and about the idea of just looking up word study fallacy, just looking up words and trying to put together what the Bible is saying about it. It's just it's not good enough scholarship. It's not good enough thinking processes and interpretive processes, hermeneutics, etc., etc. It's not good enough. What we should be doing is saying that the Torah is showing us an ancient value system exercised with integrity. Now, we're going to get to in a minute. What do we do with that? Okay, so hold on to that thought. But that's what it was trying to do and what it accomplished. So let's look at another example, capital punishment, right? We talked about patriarchy, now we're talking about capital punishment. Some approach the issue by saying that since the Torah allows for capital punishment, we cannot say that capital punishment is abhorrent to God or contrary to the moral character of God. Obviously, something God commanded at some point cannot be inherently contrary to his character or nature. But this argument still misses the point because this assumes the Torah is reflecting the moral character of God or is drawn from it. This paradigm cannot be maintained. All right, so let's talk about capital punishment, right? Again, God is not going to command anyone anywhere to do something that is inherently evil, something that is contrary to his nature or his will. He's never going to command someone to do that. So anytime God commands someone to do something or to follow something or to obey something, it has to be within that broader understanding of God's character, his nature, his will, etc., etc. Set that aside. That does not mean, again, that the stipulations of the covenant in the Torah are a reflection of God's nature, because then that makes God the lawgiver. That makes God and it's elevating the Torah beyond what it actually was to the ancient Israelites. All right, so we got to resist that somewhat natural tendency to do that and to make that connection. Let's answer the question: is what the law of Moses says about capital punishment of value for our conversations, our arguments about capital punishment in the modern world? Not the way people think, right? Again, because the reason they had capital punishment and the reason we have capital punishment is not the same, right? They were a theocracy, a covenant people, living in the relationship to God with the presence of God. That's not what capital punishment is in the modern world. Right? It serves a different purpose. It is arrived at by a different process. All right. So this is not going to be a one-to-one. Let's just line them up and say the Bible supports capital punishment, so therefore so do we. That's weak sauce. It's not going to work. Sexual ethics. As we encounter the various stipulations in the Torah, we must recall that it's designed to promote a particular understanding of order, not an absolute morality or an ideal way of thinking. Again, for example, one that's not part of our modern cultural conversation, so we're not going to get all run into our own corners about it, is the Levirate marriage. Right? If a man dies without a son, then his brother marries his widow to produce offspring for his name. It's something that does not fit our understanding. We don't argue about it because this is just not something we are inclined at all to do. Again, that was something that made sense in their context because of the value that they placed on maintaining the family name. We don't have that same value, so naturally we don't try to apply that. But we don't see that same line of thinking applies to many of the other sections or many other issues that we're talking about here. Most of the sexual aspects of the Torah had to do with what was perceived to bring order throughout the ancient world. Our practices may occasionally look the same, but they exist for very different reasons. Again, be careful here because of everybody's passions about this, but our conversations about homosexuality and gay marriage and all sorts of human sexuality conversations, we are having those conversations on a different basis for a different purpose. Their basis was maintaining order in the ancient world. Again, because they highly valued order. We do not highly value order. We highly value individual rights. And so we're having a different conversation. It's difficult for us to take their conversation and apply it to our conversation. That's a very dangerous thing to do. Again, positively or negatively. Because we are having a different conversation. We are talking about these ethical things in a different context. We are trying to achieve different goals and for a different purpose with different mechanisms, right? Again, you can't just pick that up from 4,000 years ago, plop it into our cultural conversations today, and expect it to be a productive conversation. People try to do it because it's a useful cudgel for them to either use the scriptures, the Torah, to bash people or to bash the scriptures. Again, not healthy either way. Conclusion. So, in all of this, it's clear that those who criticize the Bible for promoting a social system that is primitive or barbaric in contrast to our own enlightened views, right? You've probably heard that. It's probably, if you're a believer, it's probably made you mad and frustrated. So hold that thought. Those who believe the Torah presents an ideal social system that all should follow as God's way. So there's two very different groups of people. Walton is showing us something they all have in common. Those who argue that the society created by the Torah, if not ideal, was at least an improvement over the ancient Near East status quo. Again, it was, but that's not the point. Or even those who pointed to isolated passages in the Torah as representing God's moral or social ideas have all misunderstood the Torah. In other words, he's basically saying we're having the wrong conversation about Torah because we're not viewing it as the ancient Israelites did. We're treating it as something else. Therefore, when we argue about it, we're arguing about the wrong things in the wrong ways. And of course, that's not healthy in any setting. Need a drink, just a sec. Torah was not the revelation of a new society. It was revelation pertaining to how God's chosen people were expected to participate in the plans and purposes of God by reflecting well the name of Yahweh with whom they were identified. Again, he's not giving them a new society. He's giving them a way to live in their society in a way that makes Yahweh look good. This called for integrity as people living in the society in which they lived, as they promoted order that would be the envy of the nations around them and give honor to Yahweh, their covenant God. Again, is it better than the nations around them? Absolutely, but that's not the real point. The real point is God's reputation, God's name, God's purpose will be uplifted, and the peoples around them will look to that and say, what is this God doing? It's interesting stuff. It's good stuff. We want to learn more about that. And ultimately, of course, when the Messiah came, the people would know what to expect. So, how then do we apply the teachings of Torah today, right? How do we make use of it? Well, not as an ideal for every society. That's off the table. People having that conversation are not doing so based on the way Torah was used by the ancient Israelites, way they would have understood it. Not at all. Okay? And not as a primitive system to abandon. Again, those are the extremes, and neither of them is honoring the Torah. What do we look at? We look at it as an example of God's command that his people participate in his plans and purposes. We then ask ourselves, how can we go and do likewise? Okay, so God's plans and purposes for the ancient Israelites, for that covenant, for that time, for that place. He said, I'm doing this, you need to get on board, and here's how. Now we ask ourselves, what is God doing today? What is his plan and purpose in this age, in this covenant, right? In the new covenant. How do we get on board with that? How do we promote that? How do we support that? That's what we do. We go and do likewise by imitating what God asked them to do, be a part of his plans and purposes. Now, what we're going to do to fulfill that is not going to look like what they did, because God's plans and purposes have changed. They're not exactly the same as they were then, right? Okay, so how do we honor God's plans in the era of the new covenant? That's what we ask ourselves. What is God's plan now? What is he trying to accomplish? What is his purpose? What is his goal? And let's get on board with it. Let's support it. Let's help it. How do we elevate the name of God by being a people that reflect his name as it deserves? That was their goal. In their culture, how did they make the name of God great? Now we ask ourselves, in our culture, in our situatedness, whether we're in the West or in the East, whether we're in America or in China, right? How do we make the name of God great? Sometimes that will be working with our societal expectations. Sometimes it will be subverting them. Sometimes it will be flowing with the stream. Sometimes it will be fighting, as Walton said, to the shore or even upstream. But that's the conversation. How do we make the name of God great in this day and age? And it won't be by living like ancient Jews, or even by living like first century Jews, because that's not what makes the name of God great now. And that is our goal. That is our purpose. That is our hope, to elevate the name of God, to be a part of his plans and purposes here and now. Okay, so that was a lot, and I hope it hits home for you and you understand what I'm trying to explain. I'm doing my best here. If you have comments, if you have questions, ask them, and I will do my best to respond to those in a way that helps further this conversation. All right, we're not done. We've got more stuff coming. Because we're going to be talking about its Torah's purpose for the Israelites further. All right, thanks, and God bless.